Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Giridhar. I am from Azim Premji Foundation. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the next edition of the Azim Premji University Lecture Series. Um, Today, we have the honor and privilege of having Professor Dipankar Gupta here with us. Professor Dipankar Gupta is an eminent academic sociologist, prolific writer, and also a very well known public intellectual. As you know, of late, discourses get strident, and there is this very fine but precious and fast fading art of being able to hold conversations where different views are placed and dialogues can take place. In such a scenario, many of us have seen, at least on even the very strident TV debates that go on, that Professor Dipankar Gupta manages to bring some sanity with his own way of including people in such conversations. It's a great pleasure to have you, Professor Gupta, here. And today's talk is on modernization and its discontents, lessons from a laboratory called India. It's a great pleasure to welcome you, Professor Gupta. Over to you, and on behalf of Azim Premji Foundation.
Well, thank you very much, Giri. Thanks a lot. And thank you all for coming. I've written about modernity before, and I'll be talking about it again today with some modifications. As you know, it's always very difficult to say anything new. And I hope you'll bear with me. I've called it modernity and discontents, modernity in the singular and discontents in plural, and I hope I'll be able to explain to you why. A laboratory called India, I think we are somewhat privileged in this country because India is really a fantastic laboratory for social scientists, at least. The doctors and pathologists and epidemiologists will also agree with me. But for social sciences, naturally, I would say that India is a great laboratory because you have practically every nuance, social nuance in India. You have tradition, modernity, urbanization, rural. You have the entire spectrum, which is why I think those of us in India who are studying social sciences are actually quite blessed. When we talk about modernity, I think it's important for us to, first of all, accept the fact that initially in the early years after independence, we were all very positive and optimistic about modernity and what it was going to bring for us. The Nehruvian years in particular, the first phase, was a very optimistic one, and we thought we were on the trajectory to a good life. But very soon it kind of cratered, didn't it? I mean, there wasn't really a great upheaval against it, but it slowly hollowed out. And then after a while, modernity began to get a bit of a bad reputation about it because they identified modernity with squalor, with slums, with chimney smoke, with crime, and a whole host of other things. And eventually people said that, is it really worth aspiring to it? In fact, in some quarters, there was also a revulsion against it. Srinivas, M.N. Srinivas, the famous sociologist, when he was thinking of this subject, he wrestled with the idea, should I talk about modernity or should I talk about westernization? He wasn't very sure. Eventually, he settled on westernization because he felt modernity was actually a very difficult task to accomplish, and we in India are not quite ready for it yet. There's a psychic element in modernity which we probably don't possess, which is why he opted for westernization. And the reason he took on westernization as a subject of study because he could easily identify aspects of westernization in Indian society. For example, the kind of clothes we wear, education we get, and so forth. But that also had a problem because now when we talk about modernity, we tend to look at modernity in terms of things, like urbanization is a thing, like motor cars are a thing, fast cars, speaking English, going to certain discotheques or restaurants or whatever. Those became identity markers of modernity. And that, I think, is what has been very unfortunate for the study of modernity, because they were identified as things. And in sociology, you'll find that very rarely, if at all, we have concepts that are based on things. Most sociological concepts are based on relations between people. But because modernity was based on things, to a large number of people, you had those like You may have heard of Jalal al-Ahmad from Iran. He said that modernity is like Westoxication. It's a terrible thing. People get intoxicated on Western ways of living, and that has done great damage to our society. So there was a kind of a meat grinder battle over there, and they rejected everything about modernity because they identified modernity with things. And that is why it got a kind of a bad reputation in certain circles. But modernity should be, like other sociological terms, should always be seen in terms of relations between people. Now, you think of any sociological term, capitalism, family, whatever, there's always relationship between people. For example, when you say family, what do you mean? Do you mean father, mother, brother, sister? Just not that. But the kind of relationships you have between kinsfolk in marriage, that's what makes for a family. In family life today, as you quite well know, is very different from the way in which families were organized in the past. Now, for instance, some cases you might even say that holding a convivial family dinner is like a foreign relations act is so difficult to pull it off. Marriages are different in different parts of India, and that's not because of things, but because of relations between people. For example, in North India, we have the Kanyadan system, which is very different from the way things are done in South India or in other parts of India, where you have the cousin marriage system. There, the woman's position in the family is very different from the women's position in a North Indian traditional marriage setup. There was a time when the Jat Karps, have you heard of Jat Karps, the Jat Panchayats? They once had a meeting, a Mahapanchayat, and they decided that it was very bad, it was wrong practice really, to insist on dowry. And we shouldn't have dowries at all. And they also said that during, when the bride's family welcomes the bridegroom's family to the wedding, there shouldn't be any ostentatious display of wealth or whatever. At the most, you may give 5 rupees or 10 rupees or 50 rupees, and that's it. And it was welcomed in many quarters as a very advanced position to take, which indeed it was. You wouldn't have expected rural people to insist on this kind of practice, especially at the time of marriage. But they did. And many of us in urban India lauded the Jat Karp Panchayats for this stand. But what we didn't pay close attention to in terms of modernity was this, that they also wanted the girls to be educated, by the way. They said girls should go to school, they should get educated, but if girls want to hold a job, that is not allowed. Girls should be educated, but if they want a job, then the Jat Karp would probably get a nosebleed. You can't have a job. Why can't you have a job? Because that is not what women do. So when you think in terms of modernity, while on one hand it seemed to us, to many of us, that the Jat Karp Panchayats are becoming very modern, on the other hand, when it comes to relations between people, we found these relations still remained very traditional. You had girls who are educated, but they're not supposed to hold jobs. And why are they educated? They're educated so that they can help their boys in the family to do their homework. So that's the job that women have to do. And that is the kind of relationship that is actually privileged in these households. So a family, again, depends a great deal upon the kind of relations that exist between family members. It's just not family as a thing. Likewise, you can talk about, let's say, caste or capital. Capital, again, is not, in sociological terms, a bunch of money. It's not cash. It's, again, relationship between the entrepreneur and the worker. This is true for Marx, as it is for Weber, and a whole host of sociologists. In fact, when Marx first talked about it as the relationship between labor and capital, there was obviously a lot of resentment against that. And then, strangely enough, some of you may know that Paul Samuelson was asked, what was Marx's greatest contribution? And Samuelson, as you know, was no Marxist at all. But he said Marx's great contribution was class struggle, by which he meant, again, relationship between capital and labor. And most of those who were actually market fundamentalists and didn't quite know the subject too well thought that Samuelson was betraying them. It's like as if the chief guest had come and run away with a birthday cake. But Samuelson's point of view was simply this, that capital, again, is a relationship between people. It's not about money. Talking about money, there's another famous sociologist called George Simmel. You may have heard of him. He wrote a book called The Philosophy of Money. And in that, Simmel didn't talk about money in terms of cash and wards and notes and so forth, but he said money actually helps a person to be free. Before there was money, when there was no money, there was no freedom. Now a person may be living in a flop house, but that flop house wasn't really an iron cage. Because of money, people are free to move, free to choose their job, free to be hired, and as Marx said, they're also free to be fired. So capital actually is there for not just money, but actually it's a relationship between people. And this is something we don't often pay attention to. Likewise with religion. Religion is not, in sociology, religion is not theology. Sociologists of religion will not talk about theology, but will talk about relationship between people in the religious realm. To give you a spectacular example, that's of Max Weber. He talked about the Protestant religion in terms of the development of capitalism. It was not Protestant religion in terms of its theology. That was not important. But what did Protestant religion do to generate the spirit of capitalism? And that is what he was interested in. In Marx, for example, the Jewish question, again, it was about relations. Because when you know the famous phrase, the opium of the people? Now, the opium of the people is a sort of unfortunate way in which Marx is remembered. The opening lines of this opium of the people is sigh of the oppressed, hope of the hopeless, etc., and ends with opium of the people. So again, it is about relations. So religion too is seen by sociologists in terms of caste is another great example. Caste is not just about stratification, upper caste, lower caste, middle caste, and so forth. Caste is again about relations between people of different strata. Now, these strata can be highly contested. You might say, I don't agree that he is superior to me or inferior to me, but the fact of the matter is, when you're studying caste, you're seeing it in terms of how people relate to one another. There's very well-known sociologist here in Bangalore called Mr. Gopal Karanth. Some of you may know him. Gopal Karanth has written extensively on the Judge-Mani system and how the Judge-Mani system has changed over time. And what he's pointed out really is how relationship between people has changed and the old style patron no longer really exists. Now if you think back, you'll find that the caste system as we know it really did rather well during a time when the village was a closed economy. And most people in the village had to genuflect to the superior classes within the village. So the superior class within the village, depending upon what caste they belong to, that caste automatically catapulted itself to the top and became the superior caste, and therefore organized a vertical chain below it. And that is how the caste system as a system prevailed. But now you see a change in the relationship between people in rural India and elsewhere. Why? Because the patron that we knew in the early days, the patron has disappeared. There's nobody in the village who can really act like the old-time patron. You do see films, of course, where those films are not that popular these days, but in the 70s and 80s, but we did see films in which the landlord came on horseback and he whipped people into subservience. But today that's not happening anymore because the landlord is hard to find. When I went to West UP, my first brush with rural India, also Gujarat, South Gujarat, I was a bit disappointed because the kind of stuff I read about rural India, I just didn't see it. For example, I didn't see the landlord. I didn't see the horseback, obviously. And I said, what's happening? Have I come to the wrong place? And then I realized that the village life had changed drastically, but our books had not changed. They were still the old-fashioned books. And for a long, long time, till 2010 or so, I remember, well-known economists in the government talking about land reform, when there was hardly any land left to be reformed. But talking about land reform because they were also brought up in the old tradition. So it took a long time for us to realize that that village really doesn't exist any longer. It was once upon a time there, I suppose it was. But in my memory, in my living experience, I haven't seen really that kind of rural feudalism as I was told about in books. It exists probably in other parts of the world, but I'm not sure it exists in India in the same fashion. And therefore, the kind of caste system we knew about, we talked about it, we read about, that caste system was not really that prevalent any longer. Because if I cannot be a patron, if I cannot have that kind of power, then how can I make other people subservient to me? If I can't do what I was supposed to do, then others will obviously stand up and say, I want my place in the sun. I don't want to be under your shadow. And that's exactly what's happening in our country today. So caste has moved from being a system to being an identity marker. It's not a system like it used to be, but today it is an identity, and these identities are in conflict, are clashing against each other. And that is why you see so much of caste politics today. It is not as if people didn't think politically, but they could never ever express themselves politically because in a closed village system, there was no room for that expression. But today, because that patron has kind of disappeared and flattened out, you can stand up and say, look at me, I belong to this caste and I have a great and glorious heritage which you never recognized in the past. But now I am strong enough and independent enough to make that claim loud and clear, which is why you see a lot of caste politics today. In the past, you never had caste politics. What you had was every 200 years or 300 years, an invasion, a war, or whatever, and one caste gave way to another caste. So that's how the Rajputs became strong. That's how the Jats came to eminence. All the major kingdoms you can think of in the medieval time, the Rashtrakutas, so on and so forth, all came through wars. And as a poet once said eloquently, they slaughtered their way to the throne. And that's how they became powerful castes. No one was born powerful. No caste has been powerful from times immemorial. The status of all so-called powerful castes are historically determined. It happened in historical time, and we know when that happened. And they happened because of war and bloodshed. Today, we don't have war and bloodshed, but today our caste politics are not like the politics of the past, but based on identity, not so much on system. I'll go a little more about a slight addition to what I just said. You might also recall the number of works on caste census that the British conducted in pre-independence India. It is interesting that in the first round of the census, many of the so-called iffy castes who were not very sure where they belong claimed to be Brahmins. By 1930s, the hold of the rural dominant caste was waning because of British intervention and politics and even the independence movement. And from the 1930s onwards, they didn't want to be Brahmins anymore, but they wanted to be Kshatriyas. Now, why didn't they want to be Brahmins? Because they said Brahmins in rural India doesn't make sense. They don't wield power. It's the so-called Kshatriyas wherever they are. Those are the people who wield power. The Jats, they call themselves Kshatriyas. The Rajputs call themselves Kshatriyas. The Thakurs call themselves Kshatriyas. And they are the ones with power. And we want to be Kshatriyas. But in the past, they dare not say that. Because in a village, if you were to say I'm a Kshatriya, the Kshatriya landlord would slaughter you. But when they said we are Brahmins, it was all right. That's fine. But to say you're Kshatriya was a threat. From 1930s onwards, that threat receded. And now more and more people are saying we are Kshatriyas and not Brahmins at all. And in some places, like in Gujarat, they're not even saying they're Kshatriya, they're saying we are Baniyas. Because in Gujarat, Baniya is on the top of the food chain. So they say we are Baniyas and not Kshatriyas, and it makes a lot of sense, I suppose. So when we talk about sociology and social relations, we're not talking of terms of things, not in terms of just positions in themselves, but relations between people. So in a sense, your left lobe is supposed to be activated in sociology. And this is what was missing in the studies of modernity, because modernity was associated for a long time with things that I told you. So there was this politician's son who went berserk in a hotel in Delhi, and he shot down the chandelier and incidentally shot another person who was in the way. And of course, the newspapers went quite crazy about it, and they said, this is what modernity does. Modernity brings about these kinds of people and this kind of behavior, and it's really unfortunate that modernity has this kind of reputation in some circles, but modernity is not about things, it's about relations between people, and what kind of relations are we talking about? So now let me come to the point of relations. One of the most important aspects of modernity is intersubjectivity. Modernity is intersubjectivity, and what does one mean by that? Intersubjectivity, very simply said, is the ability to put yourself in the shoes of the other. That is intersubjectivity, to see the world through other people's eyes. Can you do that? Of course, there is a well known branch of philosophy and methodology which actually extols this point of view, which is called phenomenology. But that is a cultivated methodological stance. But for sociologists, intersubjectivity should be a kind of a habit. It should be able to do it spontaneously. But it doesn't come naturally. It does need a certain degree of groundwork for that to actually take place. There should be a certain resemblance between people, which is what led Emil Durkheim, a famous sociologist, to say, my first duty is to resemble the other person. And that's my first duty, to resemble the other. My first duty is not to be separate from the other, but to resemble the other. And that is a very difficult task to accomplish. And we will also discuss that later in the context of democracy. But that is, I think, the most important aspect of intersubjectivity. Can I see the world through the eyes of other people? Are there enough grounds of commonality between me and them? You know, you may have heard of Groucho Marx, who, of course, put a different slant to it. He said, when you step into the shoes of other people, make sure the size fits. But this is not really what I'm talking about. You should be able to see the world through the eyes of others. This is what intersubjectivity means. And the next aspect of modernity is ethics. Ethics is, again, about other people. You might remember Sartre said, hell is other people. But you have in Western philosophy, from Hegel to Levinas, where they say ethics is other people. And of course, they draw all of this from Kant. You might even find elements of this in some of the Upanishads in India, but it's expressed most clearly in Western philosophy, and which is why from mid-19th century onwards, right up to contemporary times, almost all of Western philosophy talks rarely about the subject, but always about subject-object. That is very important. No matter which Western philosophy you pick up, from Hegel to Marx to anybody, it's all about the other. That's very important. It's not about the self as much. I think Kant was probably the last person who talked about self, but even Kant was making the transition. But after Kant, you'll rarely ever find anybody who talks about the self alone and understanding the self. Self is always seen in terms of the other. And you have a host of social scientists who have actually written a great deal on the subject. And they distinguish ethics from morality. Morality has a subjective dimension. I can be moral alone. In fact, I do rather well when I'm moral alone. I am a vegetarian in the sea of barbarians who are non-vegetarians. I can also say that, my wife's in the kitchen, my child gets married at a young age, and that is all very moral. And this is my moral position. I'll throw my body against those who oppose me. This is the position I have. But this position is not about other people. You cannot say that because I am belong to a particular community, that community's morality says, or standards say, that my children should be brought up in a certain manner, my daughter should be done in a certain manner, my son should be in a certain manner, and that is the way things should be. Anybody who opposes it, we will, go flat out against it. But ethics is not about that. Ethics is when other people become very important. So you should be able to put yourself in other people's shoes. Morality is not about that. So when, someone who is very ethical turns up and says, but you can't do this to your children. You can't just do this to your wife or to your subordinates. They say, why not? And ethics at that point makes no sense to them at all. Because it's like, putting Band-Aid on a bullet wound. It makes no sense at all to them. Why should my lifestyle be different because of what you say? It has always been from tradition, times immemorial. Women have been treated this way, children are treated this way, subordinates in this way, and this is a moral position. Now, you may have heard also of this dictum, do unto others what you would have others do unto you. Now, ethicists would not agree with this. They would say this is not good enough. Because do I want others to give bribes like I give bribes to others? Is that all right? No, it isn't. Now, should I ask to be released from prison because no judge would want to be in prison? But I'm in prison, and because you must do unto others what as they would do unto you, therefore I should be released from prison. Should I actually support sycophancy because I am a sycophant? I work to my superior, so I should like my inferiors to be sycophants as well. So, doing unto others what others would do unto you is not good enough. Of course, this was statement first made by Matthew in his gospel exegesis. But later on, I think it was very smart of Luke to come up and say that, even sinners can do good. And so you cannot say, do unto others as others would do unto you, because there's a whole lot of vacant space where the wrong sorts of people can occupy. And that is when I think Kant made his greatest contribution by saying that we must have a universal category, that universally people should do unto others what universally others should do unto you. So it should be a universal statement, a categorical imperative. And that is when you say that women and men, everybody, that equal status differences are not there in terms of relationships between people. And this is where I think ethics really makes an important standpoint. And if we were to push this even further, we'd realize that there is practically no aspect of modern society which is not touched by the ethical imperative. If you don't have that imperative, you cannot be truly modern in contemporary times. So modernity is not whatever is happening contemporaneously. Like today we have terrorism, we have urban sprawls, we have ecological damage. Now, does that make us modern? No, because the ethical aspect that I talked to you about, that ethical aspect is missing. And because the aspect is missing, therefore modernity is not there. So on the one hand, you may say, well, it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, but it doesn't quack like a duck. So in that sense, terrorism or urban crime or ethnic wars or environmental damage, while they're happening today, everything contemporaneous is not necessarily modern. Now this is therefore going back to the earlier point I'd made, that if you look at modern in terms of things, then the contemporaneous becomes modern very easily. And that is something we should resist. We should look at the modernity in terms of relations between people, and in that we should say ethics plays a very important role. And we should also recognize that it is not easy to be ethical, it's easier to be moral. It's very difficult to be ethical, it's easier to be moral, because moral you don't have to really take the other into account. It's a kind of mother's milk ideology, you're moral. And ethics therefore stands out and contests morality practically at every step, because it is not even doing unto others what others would do unto you. Even that is not acceptable. The ethical realm is a very privileged realm, a very kind of rarefied zone in which we have to be very careful about, lest we slip into morality. Well, what are then the correlates of modernity? How can we tell that this is a modern society or not? Let me clarify one more point. That is, modernity is never complete. If modernity is complete anywhere, it's a farce. It cannot be. Because just when you think that all has been done, you've accomplished everything that is modern, some new challenge will come up. This is what dialectics is all about. A dialectic is not simply about thesis, antithesis, and synthesis and stop, like Hegel and Marx said. Dialectic is a continuous process. This is Fichte's position. You have thesis, you overcome that with antithesis, then you have the synthesis, and just when you thought it was done, all over, another thesis pops up. The human mind is such that's constantly striving, that never rests. So dialectics is a constant motion. Modernity is like that. It never stops. You can't say it is over and done with. We are modern. And the moment you say that, you become unmodern. Because modern is constantly looking for new avenues, new gold to strike somewhere, a new rich mine ore. It doesn't rest. It's restless in that sense. And We can, however, ask ourselves, what direction are we going? Are we going in the direction of modernity or not? As I told you, no one is completely modern, so we can only plot our steps towards modernity. And therefore, we can think in terms of certain markers of modernity. And one of them is that in a modern society, very rarely will you ever find great people or Mahatmas. Mahatmas don't exist in a truly modern society because there's no need for Mahatmas. Mahatmas come up really in unmodern societies where there is scope for them. In a society like ours, for example, Mahatmas are all over the place. You can't throw a brick without hitting a Mahatma. There's so many of them. That's because there is scope for Mahatmas. But in a true ethical society, Mahatmas should not really exist. And while some of my best friends and my family, the NGOs at work, and they do very good work, in a truly modern society, why should there be an NGO? There should be no need for that. But it happens in societies which are not truly modern, where things have to be done. I mean, you're walking down the street, you find people dying, you find people in the gutters, you find, patients without help. You have to do something. You're ethically and aesthetically compelled to do something. And that's why you have Mahatmas, you have leaders, you have great people in societies, and those societies you can easily say have a long way to go before they become modern. So modernity and Mahatmas don't go well together. It's nothing against Mahatma, it's just about society, about relationship between people. Because relationships are of a certain kind, that Mahatmas come to the fore because you can't help it, because things are so bad. People will be compelled to do something just to salve their conscience, if nothing else. Likewise, this is an iffy subject, and I'm driving on the edge, and a very narrow path at that. But if you look at India, for example, and very often people have said that look how great India is, we've thrown up a woman leader like Indira Gandhi. Some even say Sonia Gandhi. So we are very modern because we have women in the forefront. And then you might look around and say, oh yes, Sri Lanka also had women leaders. Malaysia had women leaders. Philippines had women leaders. So, the East is not so bad after all. There are leaders, women who've come to the top. But here we have to be a little careful because there are many other women leaders in other parts of the world. But a truly modern society, the woman leader would not be the one who inherits the mantle of a male ancestor. In most of these cases, I just pointed out to you, it is the male ancestor's mantle that the woman is inheriting. And it's interesting that the woman should inherit, not the son, because a woman is seen in these societies as a person without any character, like a cloth on which you can paint any color and make it a flag. A man is a problem because man is supposed to be equal to the ancestor and is found wanting. So very rarely will you find a man stepping into the mantle of a male ancestor in politics, but a woman gets in much more easily. But of course, once a woman is in, then the logic begins to change too. So by being a woman leader by itself does not mean that you've become modern. But I think the best example of modernity is from the field of sport. When I say from the field of sport, I'm not punning really, but it is very important to understand that sport as we know it is a thoroughly modern phenomenon. You didn't have sport in the past. You had games, but no sport. In so-called tribal societies, you have people playing around, but they don't play a sport, they play games, they make up the rules as they go along. And of course, the chieftains, team must win, the patrons' team must win. But when it comes to sport, it's completely different because there are rules that are universal, much just as Kant had said, that it should be universal, should apply to everybody. So when sport became sport, let's say cricket, Giri is a cricket enthusiast and a pundit too. When cricket became cricket, it became cricket because rules were framed. And when rules were framed, they were framed universally for everybody. So the spectators, the referee, the players, they all knew the rules by heart. It was absolutely internalized. You win and lose in the open. The referee doesn't blow the whistle when you do something different. The referee blows the whistle when you do something which is not allowed. For example, if Michael Jordan leaps, say, 3 feet or 4 feet, whatever, and stays still in the air, defies gravity for a nanosecond or two, and then goes up again and dunks the ball in the basket, it's all within the rules, and the referee will not blow a whistle. If Sunil Gavaskar or Sachin Tendulkar or whoever, or David Beckham bends the ball like he does, he's not breaking the rule, but he's done something innovative. And because you can do something innovative within the rules, which everybody knows, that is when you're modern. In the corporate world, when I was with them for some time, I used to often talk about sport being a model for corporate behavior. That if you look at corporate behavior in terms of sport, you know exactly what to do in times of crisis. For example, you know that a captain is supposed to bring out the best in the team. The captain may not be the best player in the team, but the captain's role is to bring out the best in the team. And those who are in the team, their job is really to make the team win. That is most important. And the rules are there for everybody. And these rules came to the fore in sport from the 18th, more particularly 19th century, and some of them in the 20th century, but not in the past. Now just ask yourself, cricket again. In cricket, when MCC was formed, those were the days of 1780s or thereabouts. Those were the days when great churning was taking place in the European world, particularly in Britain. There was anti-slavery movement, demand for rights. In fact, that was also a time when they sent the first shipload of people to Australia. Otherwise, the Ashes would never have taken place, and things of that sort. Slavery was the first formal move against slavery was made during those years. So the whole aspect of sport is really an outcome of modernity. It didn't exist in the past. It came up because now people wanted to see a universal set of rules to which everybody adheres and everybody knows about it. So the spectators know when the referee hasn't done something right. The players know. The whole world knows. And you can't win or lose in the dark. It has to be done in front of everybody. And this is the great thing about sport. And some of us don't realize how important sport is in understanding what modernity should be like. In fact, if you were to understand modernity, you must see things which most other people regard as somewhat trivial. A sport for me is not trivial at all. I think it's a very important aspect of our contemporary life, which tells you so much about what we really are and what we should be. And the ethics of sport should spread out, in fact, to other aspects of life. The other thing which is a good indicator of modernity is fashion. Fashion is a great indicator of modernity. You might remember that in the early days, in the 18th, 19th century, a person, woman or man, was supposed to be well-dressed if they had all kinds of silk, brocade, blooms, all that stuff. They're wearing them and they was to stand out. And that was the mark of being a well-dressed, fashionable person. But very soon in the 20th century came Coco Chanel, and she changed the rules of fashion and actually made it modern. Now, it doesn't really matter. What is important is the cut and the style. You should be able to wear the same clothes to work. With a little change, you can go to a cocktail party. With a little change, you can go to a sports stadium. No big deal. No longer are there plumes, no longer is there silk and brocade. In fact, when artificial silk came up, many fashion designers in the West, in France in particular, were delighted because they said that now we can make clothes that everybody can wear. Earlier, they couldn't make clothes that everybody could wear because silk was expensive. And now you have silk, which is easily accessible. So it is not really vulgarizing fashion. It is more like popularizing fashion. So today, if you look at any major fashion house, they don't make their money by producing expensive garments that are just to stand out. As Coco Chanel said, that when you wear something fashionable, the attention should turn to the person, not to the clothes they're wearing. So I would say, he looks very good today, but I don't know why. And that's simply because he's in fashion or she is in fashion. And you are in fashion only when you are visible and when you walk. When I talked to some of the fashion designers in the West, they told me that in India, you can't really have fashion because in India, you don't walk. You don't walk, you go in a car to somebody's house, you go in a car to some party, you sit in a car and come back home. So where are you walking? Unless you walk, you don't see each other. When you walk in a bus, when you're walking, when you're taking a bus, taking a metro, you are visible. And fashion depends on that visibility. Fashion, therefore, tries to make the middle class. Where there's a strong middle class, there is fashion because fashion is interchangeable. Fashion is not simply standing out and being spectacular. Fashion is being elegant, yes, but not spectacular. So this is what fashion does. If you look at any of the major fashion designers today, none of them make their money by catering only to the rich. In India, it is very different. In India, most of the fashion designers I would call stylists, not quite fashion designers, because they make their money with wedding trousers. And wedding trousers, are very expensive. There are all kinds of gems woven in with the gold and silver threads, and they're almost like a armor. They can put them on the ground and they'll stand on their own. You don't need a person. And that's what contemporary fashion designers of India are. I would rather call them stylists and not fashion designers. In fashion, you are doing something very different. You're reaching out to people. So when somebody asked Coco Chanel, what is the best color to wear? She said, whatever suits, whatever you like. You should be happy with it. That is what's very important. And there lies, I think, the touch of modernity, which we must understand. So when you come to areas like fashion, to sport, you realize that we are still quite a distance away. On the other hand, don't think that I am saying that certain countries in the West have reached the pinnacle of modernization. They have not. They're also struggling. There are always movements forward and backward, and that happens all the time. Take, for instance, democracy, which is another very, very important area where ethics trumps morality. And democracy is a very good example of that. Why do I say it? There are so many societies, so many polities in this world that call themselves democracies, republics. There are tin pot dictators all over the world that say, our party is so-and-so, republic of so-and-so, or we have had an election. It's a democratic organization that we run. But democracy is based on something else which is very central, and that is citizenship. Citizenship is the most important aspect of democracy. And for citizenship, you need the sense of ethical connect. Why do I say this? The most central principal aspect of citizenship is that there is a conferment of equality of status as a base upon which you can build structures of inequality. That was a very important position that was taken in 19th century Britain, and I think it's very important to keep that in mind. So you have citizenship where people are equal at base. They have the same lifestyle. They have access to the same education, to health, to housing. And after that, they can go ahead and be as different as they would like to be. But that should be there, that aspect of equality. And it is this that makes democracy different from everything else. And it is not just voting that makes it different. It is this aspect of citizenship that makes it important. So if you have democracy then, and with its citizenship, then you can understand what I mean by ethics. Because citizenship should also involve the element of intersubjectivity, without which you cannot have it. You cannot have citizenship where you say a particular community or caste or religion or gender is not equal to some other. They have to be the same. Liberalism is therefore an important aspect of citizenship, and that again depends upon ethics and not morality. So if you were to look at the markers of modernity, you would say that sport or fashion or the fact that no Mahatmas and democracy, where citizenship is central, these are the markers of modernity. And in no society that I know of have these things been exploited to the full, in no society. For example, when you talk about democracy, We thought, or say, you're now in 19th century Britain, and we've given the right of voting right to men who have a certain amount of property, not as much as in the past, but property. And you never thought that women should have the right to vote. It never occurred to you. And suddenly it pops up, you know. And there's the movement, there are agitations, and there are women in the forefront. And many of these women are quite militant, and some of them even, in fact, set fire to David Lloyd George's home, and they call them the matchstick girls. So women, now you cannot think of a democracy where women don't have the right to vote, right? And then when you thought it was all done, it's over with, then someone says, well, what about the religious minority? What about migrants? Again, democracy has to open up. You thought it was done, something else happens, and now you're thinking of migrants and minorities, and they should also have the right to vote. Not always are these issues brought up by people from the grassroots. As I told you earlier, ethics is not easy, morality is. Citizenship is not easy, democracy or voting is. Now, some of these issues were not brought up by mass mandate, but by leadership intervention. For example, if Gandhi had gone around saying that, do you want untouchability or not? I think 80% of Indians would have said, we want untouchability to remain as it is. But here there were certain people who were Mahatmas, who were in the forefront, and said, no, we must combat this. When we fought for the Hindu succession bill, again, it was against majority opinion. When in Europe, they fought against capital punishment, again, it was the minority that was in the forefront. But they were impelled by what? By this idea of a universal dictum, by categorical imperative. What if I am sentenced to be hanged and I haven't actually committed a murder? But I don't have the evidence, in my favor right now, but I haven't really done it, but I'm going to be hanged. To just think of that, makes you therefore work in a certain direction, champion a certain policy, which would otherwise not have happened. You have to therefore, as I said earlier, be able to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. And that is what ethics and modernity is about. So all of these things may have happened, may have come from a minority, but over a period of time, they become a majority factor. And this is what democracy does. It is therefore not easy. Anybody who says democracy easy is obviously lying to you. Democracy is a very difficult job. It is a contrived arrangement, and this contrived arrangement can break easily, and therefore you cannot take your eyes off the ball. The long and short of it is this, that if you want to preserve modernity, you cannot preserve modernity as if it has its own independent logic. It'll chug along happily forever. It won't happen that way. To keep modernity going, you have to be constantly on the watch. To keep your eyes on the ball, because it can falter, it can go back, and things can go wrong. This is the same thing with democracy. If we don't pay attention to it, things can go wrong very easily. So when we talk about modernity, it is not simply about things. It's not about things that are contemporaneous. It's always about relations between people. And these relations between people are very deliberative ones and not things that come out of your social life spontaneously. They don't. Morality comes out spontaneously. Caste oppression comes out spontaneously. Theocracy comes out spontaneously. But democracy, modernity, etc., require intervention. And if we want to be modern, we have to constantly ask ourselves, what is it that's happening today where intersubjectivity is lacking? Why is it that in many aspects of our life, morality is over-present? Once we get a handle on these issues, we'll be in a better position to take on our job of pushing modernity forward. So modernity is restless. It'll never go gently into the good night. It'll keep fighting. And I think for those of us who are interested in keeping modernity alive, we should keep this fight going and not rest on our laurels in terms of what we have already achieved. All good things must come to an end. This was not so good, but it still had to come to an end. It took a little longer. Thank you.